Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy. My guest today is Kevin Eppler. Kevin is an educator, curriculum designer, facilitator, and racial equity consultant. He's co-founder and steward of White Men for Racial Justice, WMRJ, which is an anti-racist, pro-justice community of practice founded in 2020. Kevin is also a certified program leader with the Groundwater Institute and is a learning partner at the Opt-in and has designed and led transformative, immersive experiences rooted in equity and justice. Prior to his work with WMRJ, Groundwater, and the Opt-in, Kevin spent 20 years in education as a classroom teacher, dean, department chair, and coach. He has designed courses that examine race, gender, justice, social business, social movements, and religion in both university and secondary school settings. There's much more to get into, but Kevin, welcome.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me. Real pleasure to be with you.
Yeah. You know, there's a lot going on in the world right now, and I like to check in with guests just at the start. Like on a human level, how are you doing right now? Just holding all this stuff going on.
Man, that's a great and weighty question. And I appreciate it. I appreciate you checking in. I think like many of us, we're struggling to find meaning, direction, connection, perhaps a sense of purpose. And I think this modern age that we live in, with the access to so many images and audio clips from around the world in unprecedented ways and volume, it weighs on us. And I feel very informed, or at least aware of so many of the injustices I see in the world. And at the same time, I'll be honest, I can at times feel quite powerless. And I just want to be real about that, despite the commitment I've made to the work that I'm doing with WMRJ and other organizations and other initiatives. But man, it's a lot. It's a lot. Let's be real and honest with it. And so that is, I don't have to, close my eyes and think. It's right there on the forefront of my mind and thoughts each and every day. And I'm really grateful to be in community with folks like yourself, with the WMRJ family, because it gives me a lot of strength, a lot of hope, and place to process, and then to leave inspired and encouraged about what I can control, and take action where I can, and more importantly, seek connection to those who are doing work that I find really admirable.
Yeah, I'm glad you answered honestly rather than fine. Things are great. Just our standard.
Yeah, and there's lots for me I could count many blessings, and I do that too. So that is also true, and I don't want to dismiss that or feel like I'm only focusing on the negative. Yeah, you asked a very good question, and that's where immediately I went.
Can you tell us a bit about your background and how you first got interested in the work you're doing today?
Yeah, it's a really good question that I sometimes ask myself. Where do I retreat the line to? Where back in the time how far back do I go to, like, how did I get into this? Particularly the work of organizing white men, and myself being called into racial justice work as a white man. And it's been a long road that's fraught and full of lots of missteps and pitfalls and learning opportunities. It may be corny, but I guess it's just like, goes back to my upbringing. Like, oh, well, that begs some exploration. I was raised in a really Catholic household north of Baltimore, Maryland, right on the Mason-Dixon line, and is still today a very rural and area that was both adjacent to poverty and adjacent to wealth. And my family landed pretty much smack in the middle of that, where I had extended family that I would describe as wealthy. And yet I could also say, like, I didn't fly on an airplane until I was in my 20s, until I bought a ticket for myself to fly. And any of the trips I took were usually with like church groups or something to go do a service project in wherever it may be. And I say all that to say, I don't keep much from Catholicism. Personally, I don't. It doesn't serve me well, and I had some real challenges with the teachings of the church or what I see being lived by the church. But one thing I will say that I credit my Catholic upbringing for is this pronounced sense of examination of justice in the world. Maybe I'll frame it that way. Of this understanding of suffering in the world, understanding of right and wrong, and whether you buy into a dualistic binary. I'm not saying that that's the right way to go, but I was very much aware that there is wrong in the world, that there is evil in the world as it was categorized. And I also felt a sense to call to do whatever we could about it. And I remember I went to public school through 8th grade, and then 9th grade I was going to go to the all-boys Catholic school 20 minutes away from my house, closer to Baltimore City. And I remember going the very first day for orientation to this Catholic Jesuit high school. And on the lawn of this high school were 8 crosses that were all cloaked in black. And I remember walking, it was on our tour, like literally like an orientation tour. And I'm trying to go through all my good Catholic school, like upbringing and figure out like, what's the significance of 8 crosses? Like, oh no. And I was failing. I couldn't come up with any answer, what ritual, what holiday is connected to, nothing. And so eventually I asked, I can't remember if it was the tour guide or a priest. I really can't remember, but I do remember very clearly the answer. And the answer was, well, we're mourning the death of 6 of our brethren and their housekeeper and her daughter in El Salvador. They were recently murdered. This is in 1989. And that planted a seed. Or maybe it watered a seed. I don't know how you want to frame it. And I remember thinking, wait a minute, priests are being murdered? Just that simple thought, like, huh. It was a tour. I didn't take time to ask more questions then, but I knew I had questions. I didn't know that I would get the answers to those questions maybe 5 years later in a class in college studying liberation theology and realizing the reason that those priests were murdered was because they were organizing poor people for their rights, because they were teaching land reform, they were teaching voting rights, they were trying to get people to the polls to fight against a corrupt totalitarian government that was oppressive. And for the first time when I learned that, I was like, huh, wow, like here was for me the most alive example of people living their faith, of living in integrity. And they paid with their lives. And then that unearthed so much more about justice and injustice. And quite frankly, I also learned about the role that the United States played in that. And that, again, this is I'm giving you these little vignettes from what is a complex landscape, but that was one thing that kind of like, from my Catholic upbringing, that said, hey, this is real. Meaning this is alive in the world around us. This isn't about history of things that happened decades, centuries, or millennium ago. This is happening now. And there are people who are organizing to live in accord with their values. And I was inspired by that. I thought that was heroic. In between all that, another pivotal moment for me was Rodney King, which didn't happen too far apart from that day that I was an 8th grade student on a tour of a Catholic school. And it was the awakening of my sense of something's wrong with the United States in terms of race. It sounds so naive to say that as I hear it out loud. And every time I'm just laughing at my 14, 15-year-old self. And also doing some forgiveness of like, oh, well, I understand you were 14 or 15. And that was an awakening moment. And not that I did anything about it. It just, again, watered a seed. And things began to take root. As I studied liberation theology, I studied Black liberation theology. I started reading King and X and Dolores Williams and Cornel West. And there's something about it that spoke to me. It spoke to me as a human, not as a white dude, or like just as a thirst, a crying out for righteousness, for justice, that made me come alive. That stuff got my blood pumping. That's what I wanted to learn about in history. People who organized, people who fought against systems, or that always intrigued me. It always made me interested. Cut to my first professional life. My first professional job was teaching at an international boarding school, Quaker boarding school, students from 21 different nations, 17 different U.S. states, all walks of life. Kids arriving in private jets, and limousines to come to school, and other kids arriving with a suitcase full of one pair of socks, one pair of shoes, one pair of pants for the year at the same school. We had Palestinians, we had Israelis, we had Ghanaians, we had Koreans, we had Chinese, we had, and again, Americans of all ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, class backgrounds, gender diversity. Like, it was quite an incredible learning experiment that I applaud the Quakers for creating an environment that made those folks feel, all those different types of people from their different walks of life, feel like this was a school they could at least be seen. And that school had lots of flaws. And I was a teacher there, teaching in the religion department and living on the campus and raising my family. Eventually, after like 14 years of teaching there, raising a family there. And this is all to answer your first question. So I'm unloading so much here, but I just remember teaching and feeling like myself, like I want the passion that's in me about justice in the world and justice movements and the inspiration that I feel. I want my students to feel that. And I made a fatal flaw, though, which was I thought myself good enough simply because I could talk about those movements and those people intellectually. I thought I knew them, or I thought I could say, hey, I could quote to you numerous works from Dr. King, numerous works from Malcolm X. I could bring into the classroom Fannie Lou Hamer, and again, without hesitation, and feel like, oh, I'm as a white, straight man whose face represents every advantage and privilege in American society. I thought myself, quote, like one of the good ones, because here I am teaching about Black liberation theology or about these fairly like progressive topics that no one else was doing. But the flaw, or the mistake I made, is that I never really paused to critically examine myself first, to never look internally of the ways that my own life represented advantage or disadvantage. I never sat with my own identity in any critical way. And if white supremacy, we're told, is like the culture that the U.S. is rooted in, and I'm not denying that. Folks like to say, I like to say, it's the air we breathe, it's the water in which we swim. But I never asked myself, well, if it's the water in which we swim, I have to be wet. And what are the ways in which I got wet? And like never stood there. So I acted out of a lot of like arrogance, naivete. So all of that is a really long answer to your first question. How did I get into this work? Like all of that's there. And then so obviously that means to say I caused some harm that I then learned about. I caused harm because I lacked the skill set. I lacked the competency to be able to speak openly and comfortably about my own racial identity and what comes with it. Or to have the competency and skill to recognize that students coming into my class are all coming with backpacks full of previous lived experiences and their own preconceived notions and the ways that they're wet and the way they're reacting to it. And I didn't always make those students feel safe, feel like they could trust me, because I didn't operate with enough trust building effort and skill. There's much more to unpack there, but there you go. There's a nice, concise answer to your opening question.
Yeah. And so when did American Truth and Reconciliation, that whole project, like what was that was maybe some of the earliest, or maybe, I don't know, was that some of the most formal early on organizing that you were helping do?
Yes.
Like, what is that project? And maybe where I'm trying to go is like, what is that project? And and what worked or didn't work that led into some of the work you're doing now?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The only thing that I would say is there's probably a step before that. There's definitely a step before that, which is I have this kind of awakening, this really powerful a moment of awakening, which I could talk about later at the school, where I'd been at the school since 2001, and around 2013, I attended this conference called the Race Institute. Shout out to Ali Michael, who continues to be a mentor of mine. But Dr. Ali Michael hosted this Race Institute at the school where I was teaching, and I had this transformative experience there, mostly due to a really impactful or a panel discussion that had a tremendous impact on me. My next step then was to begin organizing white students at the school and inviting them into a space to talk about anti-racism, whiteness, and to match these kind of caucus spaces that we'd already had it long established for Black students or for Asian students, but there was a need for white folks to get together and start talking about this thing called whiteness, and what does it mean to be an ally or an aspiring ally or like all these types of concepts now that we've heard much more about now, but in 2013 we're pretty new. We're new to me. Let's say it that way. So that's what was my first organizing, and then that built into like calling in adults and partnered with some other friends to create this. J. Cone Gilbert I called in to say, hey, I want to talk about some violence that was happening, and and I don't know if it was I can't remember if it was on the heels of Trayvon Martin or if it was on the heels of Mike Brown or what it was exactly, or maybe it's Freddie Gray in Baltimore, where I said, like, we got to take action. Is this bothering folks as much as it's bothering me? And Jay said, yep, I'm with you, and started immediately making some phone calls. We put together this community and conversation, which was fantastic and is still going on today. And it was just folks who were all connected to the school in some way, or a friend of the school, multiracial gathering. And that went on for, like I said, it was meeting regularly for some time. It meets far less regularly, but like I said, just had a convening of this about a month and a half ago. So that both of those predate American Truth and Reconciliation. American Truth and Reconciliation, I think the best way for me to describe it was, this was an effort by many leaders who came out of the Aspen Institute to say, what if we began an effort to talk about truth first and then reconciliation in the context of America, not just in one sector, but in every aspect of our work. So we're not just doing it in education, or we're not just doing it in business. We're going to do this in architecture and education and housing, and we're going to look at the folks in the room at our spheres of influence and say, what might it look like? And first, we committed ourselves to saying, well, we got to learn more about our history. We have to make sure we're all on the same page, and we have to see what's happening already here and now. So that dissolved, and many lessons learned there. But I think what came from that was, for me, I'll say personally, what was the most powerful aspect of that for me was the immersive experience. Yeah, I think the most powerful thing from the ATR experience for me was the immersive experience. We met in host cities where individual members within the community said, I'm going to host and create kind of the plan for the next one. So this started with Doc Jana in Richmond, creating an incredibly powerful and moving experience there in their city, saying, this is what's happening here. Here's what we know about history. Here's how we're recognizing history. Here are some folks who are leading truth-telling missions now within the city. We did the same thing in Charleston, another in Boston and LA. And unfortunately, my wife was diagnosed with cancer after the second or third one. So I wasn't able to get to Boston. I wasn't able to get to LA as we were in the midst of her her treatment. She's 5 years now cancer free, thankfully. But those experiences made an indelible mark. It just so happens I was leading immersive experiences at the school where I was teaching. They were often rooted in religion and the intersection of religion and social justice. So I was able to be in Israel and Palestine, for example, or India and Nepal, and was even designing a racial justice immersive based upon the wisdom that was gleaned from the ATR experience. And then COVID hit. And we literally the night before we were supposed to leave, pulled the plug on that trip and, broke the hearts of dozens of 18-year-olds who had been, studying and preparing and doing all this work, and mine too. But nonetheless, that ATR experience really illustrated for me the power of immersive learning. Also reminded us of lots of important lessons. Now, again, I wasn't as involved because of my wife's diagnosis, but the need to slow down, to build trust amongst a multiracial group, multigender. That was very clear, and I think actually hindered the growth of ATR. And then as that ATR was kind of was pivoting and repositioning, George Floyd was murdered. That lit another fire. And it was even, friends and connections and people who are like the ATR family extended, said ultimately to Jay and to myself, look around, let's see what's happening in the world. Notice the resistance, notice the voices, notice who's in the streets. You'll see, obviously, black women particularly leading, but lots of black folk, brown folk in solidarity, lots of white women, and lots of white youth. But there was one particular demographic that was conspicuously absent from the organizing, from the streets, and that was these professional aged white men. And so a friend of Jay's said, go get the white men. Like, where are they? And if you really want to show up and be this thing called an ally, we don't need you to save black and brown folk. Like, check the saviorism, but we do need you to go get white folks into this fight. It's been real for 400 plus years. And essentially, like, we need you, like, you're needed in this space. You need this work. We need you because it's not going to stop without you. Go get the white men. So that's kind of not the tidiest of descriptions, but that's the bridge between precursor work to WMRJ and even the precursor work to ATR.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really helpful to see that, at least for me, it was almost like you were trying to do the multiracial, multigender coalition building work and found that, there is a value and a space for white men to process our own unique, the role and responsibility that we play in society. Having a space to do that is actually like anti-racist, pro-justice, which I think is a big leap for a lot of people. They're like, what? Because like white men meeting together has never been a good thing. Never.
Yeah. That's very, very, very true. And you're right. It's very much needed for us. As I said to you, I had not done the work of examining myself. I had not done the work of acknowledging the ways in which I was wet, to use that parable again. If I'm a fish swimming in these waters, or this is the air that I'm breathing, I need to examine it. And I can't think that somehow I've been swimming in these waters and didn't get wet. So I just needed to unpack that. And I've heard and received and know it to be true that often white folks doing that, meaning doing our own learning and our own awakening in multiracial, multigender spaces, can be really, I've heard the word traumatizing, damaging, hurtful, difficult, whatever you want to say, to black men and women, particularly, or folks of color, indigenous and other people of color. I've seen it happen in spaces where I've been. I imagine I've caused it coming to my own awakening or awareness. It's not validating to Black and brown people. It's like, it's almost a form of gaslighting. Like, really? Really? You're just now? Just now? And have you thought about the implications of you just now coming to that realization at 40 years old? You know, think about all the people you've interacted with previously. What's in your wake? You know, these are like legitimate questions. And we also, and I know more importantly, like, I mean, I wouldn't say more importantly, as important, I would say, is we also know that, like, we have to be real and understand that we as white men often, I've heard it said, I felt it, we often feel like, oh, well, we're not really welcome. We're the problem. And so we're not really welcome in these conversations. And if I speak, I'm going to cause harm, and I may cause harm to myself. I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm going to be canceled is now like the more modern expression of this. And I don't want to cause, I don't, and you know, the good side of it is like, I don't want to cause harm to anybody because of my own ignorance. And I know, and I believe it's not anybody else's responsibility to end my ignorance. I have to do that. I have to take the responsibility and ownership. So that is true. And therefore these caucus spaces, whether they're white male caucus spaces or not, are really important for white people to be wrestling with and grappling with. And I think that we have seen you know, I wonder your experience too, Ryan, but I would say that I have seen men be willing to stumble in spaces with all white men, to be willing to put themselves out and say, I gotta own this, or I'm embarrassed to say this, or here's something I just realized for the very first time. And they can say that more openly than if they can in spaces that are multiracial, multigender. And that doesn't mean that's exactly what happens and that happens from day one. But I think seeing other men be willing to be vulnerable, and I don't use that word lightly, I mean, meaning to say like, hey, I got to own this and I'm going to do that. But once we see other men do it and we realize like, oh, they're okay. And actually they gained a little bit of my respect because I see them as more fully human, and I see them as courageous because they just shared that in front of a room of 50 white men. And they admitted that they weren't perfect. They admitted that they got something wrong. They admitted that they caused harm. They admitted that they felt, you know, embarrassed or whatever, or they own our anger and we sit in our anger and like, yeah, it's okay to be angry about this. I remember feeling angry myself many times, feeling like I've been lied to or like I've been duped. And then if I peeled that back, I was really feeling embarrassed and felt stupid, you know, like all these types of things that's hard to admit. And we've been conditioned certainly not to admit that in front of anybody who's not me. I may not be articulating this beautifully, but it's all to say that I've seen the power of affinity spaces. I've seen we've been told that by advisors, by Black and brown writers and thinkers and folks to say like, yeah, you guys need spaces because you're going to cause us harm. And we also need spaces where we can work through some of our own challenges and missteps, and then be held by others, be like respected, be assured, be affirmed by others. That's transformative. And that is the work of healing and equity and racial justice.
And I think one way I've heard it described, and I know you've spoken about this, but if you were to go ask like a group of Black women or someone who you're like, what should we do as white people? Obviously, you want to think through asking that question first to not put the burden on others. But what I'm getting at is they'd probably say, go get your people. I can't go to these spaces where there's other white men. Like, I'm not in these boardrooms. I'm not in these leadership positions. I'm not in these communities. I'm not in your neighborhoods. As a Black woman, I can't go into the spaces that you go in. So go get your people, because that's, in a way, I feel like WMRJ is like the manifestation of like, we got to get our own people. And it's like one of the most effective things we can do as white men is like, go get other white men.
Yeah. I've heard that too. Dr. Zoe Spencer, one of our equity advisors, says that all the time. You all have access to rooms that I can't get into. And let's also be honest, there's a certain degree of credibility or validity that comes from other white men, whether it's earned or not. And so I've seen it happen where, you know, I will say Zoe or some other person of color could say something and it gets dismissed or just washes over. And then someone who's white says the exact same thing and all of a sudden it's valid or it's credible. I've seen that happen. And so that's not lost on folks of color. And so like, great. Then go say that to white men particularly, because they're not going to listen to me. Maybe they'll listen to you. And then the other thing I'll say that's important about this, when we say like, go get your people, go get other white men, it's that, and something I would add now, and tell them that it's going to be all right. Tell them that you're welcome. Like I'm nervous. I was scared. I was worried about being in those positions, being in those rooms, talking with other white folk. And who am I? Is this going to connect? Let me just talk. That's why I often talk about my stories and just tell my personal experience. And here's what I came to realize. Here's what I know about my own life. Here's how race has showed up. But I also have learned that we have to start talking about what's in it for us. I think I may have said this to you, but I used to deplore that question when people would say, listen, I'm going to be honest with you and just say, like, what's in this for me? And I used to be like, oh, how selfish, how rude, and then I'm like, all right, take that, reframe it a different way.
It's organizing 101, right? You got to speak to people's self-interest. So,
and I get it. And it's a very reasonable question to say, hey, listen, we all feel like we've got limited time. We all feel like we've got limited resources. So why is it that I should be concerned about this? Again, don't love the question, but I understand it. More importantly, I've understood now for me the answer. For me, I hear things like, well, it's about our humanity. It's the recovering of our humanity. And that's true. I know that to be true, but what does that really mean? I'll say it this way. I have never felt a greater sense of connection or community than I do to the men in WMRJ now in my life. Like, full stop. And it certainly never felt that with men. Anybody who ever threatened me, all of the fistfights I've ever gotten to in my life, all of the violence that I've witnessed or experienced or have been victim of was perpetuated by white men. All of it. So to think that I could be in community with white men and feel a sense of closeness and connection, that is absolutely, it's healing to my spirit. It gives me a sense of community, a sense of connection, a sense of being seen and a sense of being loved. That's incredible. And surprisingly, by working mostly with white men, my relationship and connection with folks of color has also deepened and strengthened. And I now have had, since committing myself to racial justice work, the most real, satisfying, human, holistic, however you want to describe it, relationships with several folks of color. People who knew me long before I started this work, who were like I was associates with, who now I consider friends, and now I consider close friends. We're at each other's kids' birthday parties. We're at barbecues together. We're sending Christmas cards when we're at a distance, just checking in on each other in ways that wasn't happening before. So my relationships, the trust that I'm earning and continue to try to earn with Black and brown folk has only intensified, and which means I'm having incredible relationships with people who are brilliant, creative, expressive, and ways that I was closed out of by living a very kind of isolated life, a very segregated life, not even by choice, but by design. That's another thing that's in it for me. And then I realized that's on a personal level. And then on a structural level, when we talk about raising minimum wage and providing living wages, there's been immense volumes written on how the impact of creating living wages benefits everyone, benefits not just the bottom of the income, but everyone. It's called the curb cut effect is another way to say that. You might be familiar with it. I'll encourage folks to look into it. But I could just speak from a very personal level of how much my life has been enhanced by my commitment to this work. And that's the new thing. Like, that's the thing that I want people to take away from. So when white people, I get people saying, listen, like, this is just woke. This is just a way of, this is DEI, and this is to give Black and brown folk an advantage over white people. I get why you're scared of that. I get that that's what the fear is. And that's not my experience. And I've committed myself to this for over 10 years. And I'd love to talk to you about my experience. And when I'm going to get other white people, it's like, let me just tell you about my experience and how much my life has improved as a result of this. Let me tell you how much more calm I am. Let me tell you how better supportive of a husband I am, of a father I am. I'm taking these interpersonal skills and empathy and compassion and applying them to my every interaction that I have. And the ability, it's a skill set. It's an art to be able to say, hey, I messed that one up. Hey, I got that wrong. And I owe you an apology. And let me tell you my commitment to be better next time around. I didn't have that skill set 15 years ago or even 10 years ago. I have to just own that and call it being young, perhaps. But I think there's a skill that comes from being invested in the work of racial justice and equity for all people, all persons, you know.
Almost so much to cover of like, what does White Men for Racial Justice do? Like, maybe could you tell the story of like, if you're a participant and like interested in it, like what would your experience be? And like, what would be the learning approach, and like, what would you hope to learn, and what would be the goals, just so someone could like visualize like what actually happens in that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like how you frame that from the viewpoint of a participant. I think the first thing is, as a participant, you're going to be invited in by somebody who knows you. Now, we've just begun to become more of a public presence, but primarily for the last 3 years, we've just functioned on word of mouth, which means we ask everybody to say, is there anybody in your life that you think this would be good for? And who you think, we frame it in two ways. Is there anyone in your life who you think this community would be good for, and for whom this, you know, who they would benefit this community, right? And if so, reach out to them, you know, because we all have something to contribute. We all have something to learn. So that's your first experience is somebody, you know, it's Ryan reaches out and says, hey, this has been a really meaningful experience for me, and I think you'd be great for it. I think you have a lot to add and a lot to gain. And so we invite men to participate in what we call our Foundations experience. Foundations 101. Ryan, you've helped facilitate that with us. And that is an 8-week introduction to the community, WMRJ. You come in with somewhere between 20 and 30 new members who are basically considering whether or not this is a community that's for them. And you're committing to 8 sessions in 8 consecutive weeks. Tuesday night on Zoom, and there's with a little bit of work in between. Usually it's listening to an episode of a podcast in which we center our foundational experience on, called Seeing White, from Seen on Radio out of Duke University. And it's not just listen to that and come and talk about it. It's listen to that. We're going to have some guided conversation. Here are some prompts that we want you to write about and to journal before you come to the next meeting. So about an hour to 90 minutes of work in between. Because you listen to the episode, you come in, you're ready to talk. It's then we build this community rooted in norms. Here we start with a recognition of, hey, here's what we're agreeing to honor as we come into the space. Here are our kind of 10 rules of engagement, if you will. We call these community norms. Things like we're going to honor privacy. We're going to speak from our own experience. We're not going to lend advice. We're going to grow curious about any discomfort we're feeling, and we're going to be willing to take risks. And we're also going to recognize that we're not going to solve the problem of systemic racism in 8 weeks. We're going to just take that burden off our shoulders and just say, I'm here to learn, I'm here to grow, I'm here to contribute. And yeah, we do that as a community of 30 or so men for about 8 weeks. At the end of those 8 weeks, we're then said, hey, if you like this, we meet every Tuesday. We'd love for you to come. And then they have what we call a module experience, where we commit to a topic of learning, of deep learning and reflection for 2 to 3 months. And we always say this is rooted in a praxis cycle. So it's learning, it's reflecting, and then it's acting and taking action. in our spheres of influence. And we do that 3 or 4 times a year, meaning we move from one module to the next after 3 or 4 months. Now, each module will have guest speakers, most often folks of color who are leaders in their field or that work, who will come and talk to us about an initiative. Sometimes they lead us in trainings, how to have difficult conversations about race, whatever it may be, to make sure that we're feeling connected to those folks that are leading this work, and particularly to Black and brown voices. So we're not centering, only the experience of white men, and it's important for us to examine that, but we need to be checking in and guided by, again, people doing incredible work, folks of color primarily. So that's basically the cadence.
Can you speak to the equity advisors piece, just so it's like rooted in guidance from folks of color? I just want to double click on that one.
Yeah, that's important. It's not just guidance from, it's also accountability to, right? Because a lot of times folks will say, wait a minute, you white guys, aren't you the problem? How is it that you are just going to convene this space, and how do you know what to do? And which is a fair question, to which I've heard facts of folks say, hey, there's lots of volumes of information out there that you could call together and create a really robust curriculum. And that's important. And it doesn't mean we're going to see everything, we're going to get everything right. So it's really important to have advisors who are connected to the community, who challenge us, who push us in new directions, that call to mind or call us to consider things that maybe we had overlooked or not we didn't dive deep enough into. And they say, wait, no, go back to that. Or you left out this dynamic, and I want you to go back to that. So we're blessed to have Dr. Zoe Spencer and Taylor Paul as our equity advisors, and they're beloved in the community, and they, as you know well, are not always front and seen every week, but they make periodic appearances. And the one place where we have them almost every time is with us when we go to immersive experiences, which will be the case again in the end of April when we're heading down to Montgomery.
You want to drop a plug on any of the immersive? Because I think it ties back to the ATR piece.
Yeah, it really does. I can't say enough about the value of experiential learning. As an educator, any educators listening will know, yep, experiential, immersive learning is like no other. That's why field trips exist in schools. It's why these senior projects exist in many schools, these mini-mesters, these semesters abroad in colleges, because the best way to learn is to be immersed in the experience, in the community, as Brian Stevenson says, to get proximate to people and problems that we want to the problems that we're trying to solve, to the communities in which that are most impacted. So if you really want to learn, just like, archaeologists and geologists, like you're not standing in a classroom most of the time. You're trying to get into the field and get your hands into the dirt. So these immersive experiences are incredibly powerful and transformative. And one that we have committed to going to annually is to Montgomery, Alabama, and particularly the Equal Justice Initiative sites. Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative have done incredible work to create arguably the most powerful museum experiences I've ever had. It's on par with the Holocaust Museum and Yad Vashem, which I've had the honor of attending as well. It's just it resets. It's a recalibration of understanding, of depth, of knowledge, of narrative, and then to be there and process that in community and to say, what does this mean? How now shall you live? Is really important, as opposed to just going, with you and a friend or you and a family. Like, that's important. There's a lot of value in that too. But to do it in a community of 50 plus men, who we had 55 people go last time, that adds another layer of complexity and depth as you're seeing the ways that this impacts us. So these experiences, I think, are critical to our own learning and examination, and being, putting your feet on the ground and understanding that this is an ancient history. This is here and now. You don't need to travel to Montgomery, Alabama. You could go to any corner of America, walk out your door, perhaps even on your front lawn, and ask the question of, whose land was this 300 years ago? And just ask that question, and to sit and hold that and the intensity of that, and then to do that powerfully with dozens of others whose perspective and experiences is only going to inform yours and make it deeper. That's real transformation. Brian Stevenson and Equal Justice Initiative have created these masterpieces, just absolute brilliant memorials and living museum experiences that I think should be on the required experience list of all Americans, if not world citizens, to understand our history in its fullness.
So, Kev, in moving towards the end of our time here, I'm curious what we often ask this to guests, like, what do you need right now, and how can the listeners help you grow this new economy?
I'm going to give you my first instinct. What do I need right now? I don't know if it's what I need. Maybe it's I want to see the end of the vilification, the demonizing of poor white America. I want poor working class white folks to know that they're seen and loved and valued, and that there's a place for them in this work, and that this work will benefit all of us. And so I want love and mercy and grace and kindness, all those things is what I think the world needs, and me personally. And I want other white men to grow curious and to come with an open mind and say, let me just check this out. Maybe this is for me. Maybe there's something here for me. And if you're angry, I want you to feel like this is a safe space to be angry. Like, yeah, talk to me about what you're angry about. I get it. And again, I could just speak about my own life experience and what I saw and the ways I've been angry. So that's the thing that's the first thing that came to mind when you said that. I was like, all right, I'm just gonna be honest and unfiltered. So that's it. I want folks, to your listeners, if you're a white man and you're not yet in WMRJ or haven't heard of us, go to WMRJ.org. Watch the short video that I think is 2.5 minutes on our landing page. Sign up for the newsletter. Come check out a foundation session. If you don't identify as a white man and you're listening to this, I imagine you know lots of white men. And I imagine if you are somebody who listens to this podcast and you are not a white man, that you'd really love white men to show up for equity and justice. So tell them about this podcast or this episode, or tell them about WMRJ. And grow curious about it and say, I'm love to learn more myself. We do have lots of folks who don't identify as white men reach out to us. White women, folks of color, trans community folks, like, can you tell me more about what community's doing? And I'd love those questions, love to be in conversation, love to hop on a call. So spread the word, come check us out and offer us your feedback. And don't hesitate to say, this is what gives me pause. This is what I'm most worried about when I hear white men for racial justice. Like, yep, totally get it. Let's talk, and love to have that conversation. So that's what I need. That's what I ask, and look forward to hearing some folks reach out and say, heard you heard your conversation with Ryan, and would love to know more. Obviously, you could reach out to Ryan Honeyman as well, particularly if you're in personal relationship with him, and he could share his own perspective and experience.
Awesome, Kev. I just would also say, you reminded me, the community is not like straight white Anglican men. It's like we have queer men in the group, we have trans, we have men who identify as Jewish. So it's like we just self-identify as white, a white man. And so I guess it's an important aspect of being inclusive that usually you wouldn't necessarily think about, right?
People say, is anybody welcome? Anybody who identifies as a white man. And so, and lots of folks say, what about, and what about, and what about? And there's lots of good questions there, and I'm happy to take those as well. So encourage you to reach out and just say, we know that white men have our own particular work to do. It's different work. It's not any less or more important. It's not any less or more challenging than the work that all of us are doing in our own life. We just know it's different. And so this is our attempt to answer what we know and learned and have seen and recognized within ourselves is a need.
Well, Kev, thanks so much for joining. It's been a pleasure. I feel like we have a whole nother episode. I was going to ask you about music and talk about Wrexham and soccer and stuff, but this is I'd love to do another one.
Please, I love those conversations too, for sure. Yeah, Ryan's letting everybody know I'm a huge music fan, huge sports fan, particularly loves the sport of soccer. Yes, for another time.
For another time. All right.
Ryan, thank you so much for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.